I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our investigation into the exorcism of Roland Doe. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my bewitching co-host, Alice. Hello, Alice.
Oh, that was good.
I know.
So, listeners, you should know that Brett has had a long work day, and he has faced many professional and logistical challenges today. But the most nervous he was all day was coming up with a descriptor for me, and that was good.
It's a lot of pressure. I was telling Alice I realized that I called her haunting twice during the week or the month of October, so I had to make up for it with a strong superlative to end this, the most superlative of all months, October. Halloween is just around the corner in just a couple days. And I know some of you are very excited about that because we're going to be going back to our normal programming of murder and mayhem and leave some of this supernatural stuff behind. I did want to give a shout out to Harriet. Harriet wanted us to do an exorcism, and that's one of the reasons we are doing this case in this, of all, the perfect month to do an exorcism.
Absolutely. Harriet has been with us since the beginning, and she asked about exorcisms from the beginning, and both of us said to each other, we have no idea what an exorcism story looks like, but for Harriet, anything.
Yeah, Harriet's awesome. She's a super fan of mini podcasts, and her kindness keeps us going. So hello to Harriet. Hope you're doing well. Take care of yourself. Don't be a stranger. This exorcism's for you. So
thanks. You heard a little bit about Brett's day, but I also want to give a shout out to all those multitasking people out there who listen to our podcast, who have very little time and still make time for our podcast, especially all you multitasking moms. I know we've gotten lots of tweets and emails from people who have newborns or are so busy with their kids and their full-time jobs and, everything that they have going on and still say that they make time for a podcast. I just want you to know I feel you. I am actually recording and currently sewing buttons onto my son's shirt because that's what's happening right now.
That is multitasking. I can't sew when I'm not recording a podcast.
Well, this is the quietest time I've had all day to actually sit down with needle and thread and have the time to talk to you, Brett, talk about my favorite exorcism, and to sew some buttons on a shirt.
Life is just way too busy these days. We need more time to focus on our podcast. That's my thought. In general on things. We'll stop complaining. You guys you're sick of our complaining already. I can already feel it. In the future when you're listening to this, you're like, shut up and talk about the exorcism. So that's what we will do. So yesterday we talked to you guys about the exorcism of Roland Doe. We went through the sort of overall story, got it out for you. So if you're sick of this, I guess you can just go ahead and drop us now, because now we're going to talk about sort of some unusual things about this. I mean, it's an exorcism, so the whole thing's unusual. But, kind of go through the timeline and talk about what we think about this. Do we think this is potentially a legitimate exorcism, an actual case of possession, or is it something else? What are some of the factors that might make you believe that or doubt that? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we'll start off with a timeline. Alice mentioned this sort of at the end of the last episode, but this took a lot longer than we even, made it sound like when we were talking about it yesterday. I mean, this is something that took days and days and days. And I think if you look at the timeline, you sort of see that. So, Alice, I'll turn it over to you for the timeline.
Sure. So you guys heard not even the full story, but a much more detailed story. But to resituate you, we have a timeline of what happened that led to the exorcism. So, January 15th, 1949, is the first manifestation. As you may remember, the scratching starts. But it doesn't just stay as scratching. Things gradually get worse, and it's witnessed by multiple people. On February 26th, these manifestations now appear as scratches on Roland's body.
And, just to reinforce that, January 15th is the first occurrence. The scratches on Roland's body don't appear for over a month later. I mean, it's a month and 11 days, basically. It's kind of crazy, like I said, how long this took.
Right. And during that time, the people who are hearing this, including Roland, think they're going crazy. It's nonstop. Remember, they think it's vermin, it's mice, so they get an exterminator to come, and they think they deal with the issue, but then it comes back, and in different types of manifestations now. And I think this is a big deal on February 26th when the scratches appear on Roland's body, because before it's kind of supernatural, weird things happening around them. It's to fruit around them, it's to furniture, but it's not personally to anybody. Now it's personal. And it gets worse. It doesn't stop. Roland is just the center, beginning to be the center of this possession. And so the family reaches out for help. On March 16th is when the exorcism begins. And remember, at the beginning, they ask how long it'll take for this demon to exit the body. And 10, or an X, was scratched onto Roland's body, indicating perhaps 10 days. And indeed, it took 10 days. Because on March 26th, the possession seems to end, but suddenly it returns a few days later. In kind of an act of desperation, on April 1st, Roland is baptized. And if you remember the story, it was not easy to get Roland baptized. This possession fought the baptism. The next day, April 2nd, Roland receives the Holy Communion as a Catholic now. And still, the exorcism is not complete. April 18th is when the exorcism is finally complete. Just keep that in mind. March 16th, the exorcism begins. More than a month later, the exorcism is finally complete.
And this is basically every single day they're performing the rite of exorcism. If you can just imagine, I mean, it's, these guys, by the end of this, they must be completely exhausted because they're essentially getting over to Roland's house as the sun goes down and then fighting this sort of exorcism battle straight out of the movie The Exorcism all night long until Roland essentially passes out. And then they go and get some rest and they're back at it that night. And this is something that goes on for a really long time. And it's sort of a miracle that everybody made it through okay.
Absolutely. I can't, the faith that must have kept on for over a month for the family, for Roland, for the priests, I can imagine, feeling like it was never going to end.
And I think that goes to, the question, and we talked about this yesterday, the question that sort of hangs over all this is it real? Or is Roland making it up? Or does he have some sort of mental illness? We talk about mental illness a lot on this podcast. I'll say, in researching this, I didn't get a lot of people saying they thought this was mental illness misdiagnosed as an exorcism. And I think one of the reasons for that is it doesn't seem like Roland ever had any problems going forward. If it had been schizophrenia or something along those lines, you would expect they do this exorcism, maybe that works for a little while as sort of almost like a placebo effect, right? Like he believes he's cured, so he is, but you would expect it to come back, but you don't see that. So most people who are skeptical here think that Roland was essentially faking it. This is a sort of a precocious, mischievous 13-year-old who is faking this whole thing to freak out his parents and to get attention. That's what they think. And the fact that this went on so long, you just have to wonder, these priests, would they have put up with this for this long if they thought Roland was faking it? If they had any inclination that this was just to get attention. I mean, surely they wouldn't spend over a month of their lives every single night with this kid. So either they believed it was real, or man, he deserves 5 or 6 Oscars for the show he was putting on every night.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the sustained faking. Maybe for a couple days, maybe for a week, but for months, I don't know.
You think he'd get sick of it
Yeah.
eventually, I mean, maybe he just convinced himself that maybe even he was convinced it was real, and it just took a really long time for him to finally sort of come out of himself. But yeah, I mean, that kind of dedication on either side, either the faking side or the exorcism side, it just makes you feel like they thought this was real, whatever was actually going on.
Right.
So one person that I think we need to talk about more is Father Albert Hughes. If you have heard this story before, you're probably thinking, and it wouldn't surprise me if we don't get comments about this, that we skipped a big part of it. That we skipped a part that's sort of pointed to as one of these sort of more spookier events. And so let's talk about Albert Hughes. So most retellings of this story claim that the exorcism we have told you about, the one in St. Louis, was not the first exorcism. That in fact, there was an exorcism attempted in Washington before the family even went to St. Louis, and that it was conducted by this father, Albert Hughes. Hughes, you may recall, we mentioned him. He was the priest who originally gave the family holy water. He's the one who blessed the candles that the, like flying comb put out. So according to some tellings of this story, Hughes decided he wanted to go ahead and perform an exorcism. It was recommended against doing so by the Archbishop of Washington, but he was sort of brash and headstrong, and he was going to do it. Now, look, one thing we know about Hughes is he is not the kind of person who should be conducting an exorcism. Exorcisms are supposed to be conducted by an older priest. Let me read to you. I will read to you from the Roman rituals instructions on who should perform an exorcism. A priest, one who is expressly and in special wise authorized by the ordinary when he intends to perform an exorcism over persons tormented by the devil, must be properly distinguished for his piety, prudence, and integrity of life. He should fulfill this devout undertaking in all constancy and humility, being utterly immune to any striving for human aggrandizement, and relying not on his own, but on the divine power. Moreover, he ought to be of mature years and revered not alone for his office, but for his moral qualities.
In other words, I think it's recognized by the church that exorcism really takes a level of wisdom and protection from the evils that you are trying to exorcise. So you can't have kind of a young, vulnerable, not vulnerable in the sense of being swayed by the devil, but more not having the experience, right? Exorcism is like this next heightened level of spiritual warfare.
I think that's right. It can't just be anybody off the street doing this, or even just any priest off the street doing this. And that might seem a little unusual, but I think you've kind of put your finger on it. This is the next level of spiritual warfare. This is not dealing with other people or ministering to other people. I mean, this is going to head with a spirit. And if someone's going to do that, it should be someone who is older, more experienced, wise, who's faced trials before, who's not young in the faith. And that's sort of the idea of who should tackle this. And that just wasn't Father Hughes. And as I said, in most tellings of the story, he was brash and he was kind of arrogant, and he wanted to do this to sort of show that he could do it. The exact opposite of what's supposed to be happening here. We're not doing it for your own aggrandizement. He wanted to do it. He wanted to be the one who did it. And so as the story goes, he has Roland checked into a hospital in Georgetown, and he wants to start performing this exorcism. And as part of it, he has Roland sort of strapped down in a bed for his own protection and for the protection of Father Hughes, because he's not sure what's going to happen when he starts this exorcism. In this telling of the story, another thing happens that is important or would be important. As we said yesterday, one of the signs that someone is possessed is they're able to do things that they are not able to do ordinarily. One of those things is speak other languages. Latin is a popular one. And according to this telling of the story, you have Hughes who has Roland strapped down in this hospital, and Roland says to him, "O sacrados Christi, tuscis me esse diabolum, cur me derogas," right? Which is Latin for, "O priest of Christ, you know that I am the devil. Why do you keep bothering me?" If Roland was able to do that, I mean, that's obviously a huge sign that this is not him just playing around. And the story goes that after he says that, and the priest is getting ready to do this exorcism, that Roland actually manages to get out or get one of his hands loose from one of these bonds that has him tied down and works a spring from the mattress and then attacks the priest and essentially takes the spring and drives it into his arm all the way up at the shoulder and cuts him from his shoulder all the way down to his wrist. And he did so deeply that the priest would never again have the full use of his arm. So just the most dramatic thing you can imagine
Gosh.
happens in this exorcism. It's a great story, right?
It is a great story, and it's terrifying. Almost like it can't be true.
Almost too good to be true. And in fact, it seems like it probably is too good to be true. Obviously, there's a record of Father Hughes, but no one's ever been able to confirm this incident. They've never been able to show that he was wounded. They've never been able to show, as most people tell this story, that he sort of slinked away into obscurity because he was so overcome by what he saw that he couldn't, face his parishioners or whatnot. And a lot of people think this is a total fabrication and it never happened because there's nothing to back it up. And they use that fact that this is a likely fabrication to undermine the entire story, to cast doubt on the entire exorcism. And if you've looked into this, you've probably seen this as sort of exhibit number one of why you can't believe this story. But what's interesting about this story is not in the diary. It's not in Father Bishop's diary. You will not read about this if you read Father Bishop's diary. We know that Hughes did seek permission for an exorcism, to begin an exorcism, but the family had already decided to go to St. Louis by the time he even talked to anybody about it. So his whole plan was thwarted. So there was never an opportunity for any of this to happen. And I think, personally, the fact that the diary sort of refutes this story just goes to show this is a embellishment, a later embellishment of this story to make it more dramatic, to make it more like The Exorcist. And it really doesn't go to whether or not this story happened or whether or not Roland was actually possessed.
And so the not being able to confirm such a serious injury, I think, is very telling. But also, it sounds like Father Hughes continued to practice as a priest even after Roland's experience. It would be surprising that a priest who didn't get permission to perform an exorcism did perform an exorcism, have it go terribly wrong, and not be disciplined in some way that would be viewable from the outside, right? It sounds like he continued to minister to his flock.
And I think that's just another sign that this was made up. I think it was probably made up by somebody who knew a little bit more about dramatic storytelling than they did about the Catholic Church and thought, well, if this priest wants to go to the exorcism, he can just do that, right? And that's just not the way it works. I mean, the whole idea, the ordinary, which is the person who is in charge of the area, usually the archbishop, they have to give permission to do an exorcism. It's not something you just do sort of willy-nilly. Without that permission, he's not going to do it. So this idea that they told him no, and he's like, I'm going to do it anyway. It's like he's like Qui-Gon Jinn. He's gonna train Anakin, even if the Jedi Council says no. That's not how it works, right? So there's no indication he did this. There's no indication he ever got permission to do it. There's no indication he was injured. There's no indication he was ever disciplined. So I think this is one of those things that we can sort of say, hey, it's a great story, but it didn't actually happen.
Way to pour cold water on a really cool theory.
Sorry. This is what we do. That's our job. It's our
The
role.
cold water prosecutors. So what we do know is Father Bowdern led the exorcism, and he was a Jesuit and a veteran of World War II who had seen combat. What we know about Father Bowdern is that he was tough and sober-minded. When he was called to perform the exorcism, he studied extensively. In preparation, he fasted extensively, which is a form of prayer and focusing the mind throughout the ordeal. He would later say, and I quote, "The case in which I was involved was the real thing. I had no doubt about it then, and I have no doubt about it now." I think that quote itself is very, very, it gives you a lot of insight into this. So this is, probably not this father's first exorcism. He has seen spiritual warfare in probably lots of different manifestations, not just within possession. And for him to say, this is the real thing, I knew it then and I still know it now with hindsight, I think probably debunks a lot of the theories that Roland was faking this, right? He's probably seen people fake things for whatever reason. A father's job is like to listen to confession, right? To listen to people's deepest, darkest secrets and to kind of know what human psychology and how humans act in certain situations.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who's experienced not only as a priest and his experience not only in sort of that priestly role, but he's seen the world too. I mean, this is not a sheltered guy. This is not a guy who spent all his time locked in a basement somewhere reading, old scrolls or old treatises from the Middle Ages on exorcism. This is a guy who was in World War II. I mean, he was a priest in World War II. He saw combat. He saw the worst of mankind. And on the other side, he was a Jesuit. He was a scholar. He was somebody who studied. He wasn't someone, his reputation was somebody, like Alice said, who was very sober minded. He was very clear thinking. He was also very passionate and faithful, and he had a deep faith, and he thought this was the real thing. I don't think there's any question about that. And he was the one leading it. We're going to talk about two other priests in this, but he's the guy who was on sort of the front lines of this fight. And it seems like from the moment it happened to the moment it ended to the moment he died, he believed this was the real thing.
Right. Like Brett mentioned, there were two other priests who participated in this exorcism. I think that alone shows you how serious this particular exorcism was, to have three experienced priests working on it really solely for over a month. It is quite the resource drain. So we've already talked a lot about Father Bishop. Remember, he was the priest who documented everything in his diary. He taught at St. Louis University, and the way that he got involved in Roland's case was he was contacted by one of Roland's cousins. Father Bishop was then the one who then reached out to Father Bowdern to perform the exorcism. Father Bishop assisted in the rite and, as we've said, documented what he saw. And that's a lot of where we get our story. And it's firsthand accounts written from someone who was in the room, who saw what was going on.
And I think that's another one where he saw it firsthand, and he was so convinced of the reality of what he was seeing that he did make the effort and take the time to record this, so that as a tool, as a manual almost for other priests who were in similar situations, that they could use to know what they were up against, know what to expect, and to know how to handle the situation.
Right. I mean, you mentioned how exhausting this exorcism must have been, spending all night fighting with whatever was possessing Roland. And then he found the time to document each of this every single day. I think shows how seriously he took this. If you thought this was some sort of hoax, why spend more of your time when you could be sleeping or resting instead of writing down what just happened for the past 12 hours? Now, the third priest was Father Walton Halloran. He was also a Jesuit, and Of all the three priests, he was probably the most skeptical about the events that occurred. He had been called in as an assistant for this exorcism. Essentially, his job was just to hold the boy down during some of the more violent events. And you remember how violent he had, superhuman strength greater than he should have had as a child. And so Father Halloran's role really was to just be his restraints. And he wasn't sure if what he witnesses was paranormal, preternatural, or merely a child with mental issues. And when asked in later years if the exorcism was legitimate, he declined to comment, saying it was beyond him to judge. So that's interesting. Of the three who participate, the one who has kind of the lesser role of the three doesn't come outright and say that he doubts the reality of the exorcism, but he does decline to comment. Whereas the other two, I think, do not hesitate to say what they saw they think is true.
Yeah, and there are the people who are skeptical of this always point to Father Halloran and say, look, if he thought this was real, he would have came out and said he thought it was real, and he didn't, and that indicates that he probably thinks it wasn't real, that he thinks it was something else. And that may be true. I don't want to speak for the father. I mean, I know what he said, which was he did not feel as though he was in a good place to judge whether it was real or not. I think he had a healthy skepticism of things, which is a good way to come into this, but I don't think he was closed-minded about it either. And I also think he's a Jesuit. I mean, I just keep coming back to this Jesuit thing because if you don't know Jesuits or know the way they are, I just don't think he would have any problem saying, I think this was all bunk, if that's what he thought. I think he would just come out and say that. I don't think there's any well, he can't say it was fake because everyone would be so disappointed in him or look down on him or whatever. If anything, I think probably your average Jesuit priest probably would be skeptical of this whole exorcism thing anyway. I think that would be their position. If anything, coming out and saying you believe that these exorcisms were real and that this was really a demon and it wasn't just mental illness, I think that would put you in a more sort of
mainstream view of the Jesuits.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's
The mainstream view of the Jesuits is this is not real. Jesuits are they're an interesting group of people. And it's hard to describe them. And I think people just think all priests are the same and all these different groups of priests just think the same thing. And that's just not right. Jesuits typically, they are more scientific, and I think they are much more likely to say that this whole demon possession thing is, superstition from the Middle Ages and not something we should be describing in the modern age.
The current Pope Francis, is a Jesuit. If you have any knowledge of the current Pope.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That's probably one of the few Catholics of any stature that most people have any knowledge of, and just think of how he is different from the prior Pope, from Benedict, even Pope John Paul II, and his approach to things and the things he says and the way
he's of the people,
himself.
Loves the people. Right. So, I mean, he's very learned as well. The Jesuits do a lot of writings. They're scholars.
Yeah. To me, it is one of the most interesting things about this exorcism that it's three Jesuits who did it. I think that's really a just really interesting aspect of this. And maybe Jesuits are always the ones doing the exorcisms, and it's not that unusual a thing. But exorcisms don't happen that often. And to me, I think that is interesting. And it's not surprising to me at all that one of them was skeptical of the whole thing. I think that actually fits. It's more surprising to me that the other two weren't skeptical, that they seemed to be completely convinced that this was an exorcism.
Brett, on that note, do you know what the stats are? I don't know if the Catholic Church documents every exorcism, if they have to or do or make public anything, but do you happen to know how many exorcisms take place across the world, across this, the United States in a year or a decade?
I don't know that. I don't think anyone knows that. I think kind of like this exorcism, the Catholic Church keeps that close to the vest. Exorcism had fallen out of favor for a very long time. My understanding is exorcisms are actually much more common today than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago. The Catholic Church has really sort of reinvested in exorcism as something they do, but I don't know, the statistics on that, or how many, or where. I just, yeah, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody does outside of the Vatican.
Got it. So, kind of the giant elephant in the room. We've talked about the exorcism and the supernatural things that seem to be surrounding it, but why did it take so long? You've talked about the Catholic Church doing exorcisms, and again, I don't know that many exorcisms, but this one just seemed like it took so long. So why was it so long?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think a lot of people wonder if this were real and there's a demon, why is it that they can't just say, "Begone, unclean spirit, I'm a priest. The power of Christ compels you," or whatever, and the spirit just leaves? But there actually is a biblical foundation for some exorcisms taking time, and maybe some exorcisms taking longer than others. If you want to turn to your scriptures to Matthew chapter 17, there's a story in that chapter of the Bible about Jesus casting out a demon. And it's interesting because it's a demon that his disciples were unable to cast out. And by this point in Jesus' ministry, he had given power to his disciples to, heal the sick, cast out demons, all that sort of thing. They're supposed to sort of go forth and spread the word of Jesus. And to back it up, they could do things like cure people and cast out demons. But then they run into this guy and they try to do it and it doesn't work. And so here's what Matthew says about it, starting in verse 14. When they came to the crowd, a man came up to Jesus, falling on his knees before him and saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic and is very ill, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. I brought him to your disciples, and they could not cure him." And Jesus answered and said, "You unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked him, and the demon came out of him, and the boy was cured at once. So, the disciples try and cure this guy. They can't do it. Jesus does it, snap of the fingers, which, I mean, he's God's son, so you would expect him to be able to do that kind of thing. But anyways, the disciples are kind of like, "Hey, I thought we were supposed to be able to do this," right? So they come up to Jesus afterwards, and the Bible says, "Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not drive it out?' And he said to them, 'Because of the littleness of your faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. But this kind,'" talking about the demon, "'does not go out except by prayer and fasting.'" So the indication from Jesus is you could have done it, but it was going to take some time, and it was going to take some prayer, and it was going to take some fasting. Alice mentioned earlier, that's one of the things that the priest did, was they were fasting in preparation for this exorcism. So they knew this one might take some time. And it seems like whatever was going on with Roland, if you think he was possessed, if that's your opinion, he was possessed by, something that was going to take time. It was going to take a lot of prayer. It's going to take a lot of fasting. It was going to take a lot of work. And so I don't think it's one of those things where the fact that it took so long means it wasn't a legitimate exorcism, because if it had been a legitimate exorcism, they would have been able to do it more quickly.
Yeah, you know what jumped out at me when you read that verse was the littleness of your faith. That's why it didn't work. And that makes sense why kind of the younger priests who weren't as experienced were not supposed to do the exorcisms, right? Because it says right here in the verse, Jesus himself says, it takes a lot of faith. It takes a lot of experience to do something like this.
Right. And it's interesting. We don't want to turn this into like evangelical podcast or anything. But if you look at this, think about who Jesus is talking to. He's talking to his disciples. He's talking to the people who have given up everything to follow him. Nobody believes in Jesus more than they do. In fact, they got lots of reason to believe in Jesus, because not only have they followed him, but he has given them the power to do these things. They have healed people before. They have cast out demons before. But this demon, for whatever reason, was one that even somebody with their faith could not cast out. So it's interesting that he says that he calls them, or he talks about the littleness of their faith, because in relative terms, their faith is much greater than your average person. And I think this does go to what Alice was saying and what the Catechism talks about, that you need somebody. A priest is very faithful, even if they're young. They're very faithful. They've given up everything to be a priest. They've taken vows of, all sorts of things, poverty and chastity and sometimes silence. And yet, that's not enough. You need somebody who's spent a lot of time in this if they're going to go up against, the worst of the worst. And I think that's what you're seeing here as well.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a lot about kind of weird aspects of this case, but we are the prosecutors. So are there any prosecutor angles to an exorcism done by the Catholic Church? Well, something comes to mind immediately after hearing all of the physical trauma that Roland underwent, and also how physical this exorcism was. Was this child abuse? If Roland Doe had a psychological issue, could the priests have been prosecuted? What if he even died during the course of this exorcism? And you might be saying, how could you possibly die from an exorcism? Well, it's happened before. In the famous case of Annalise Michel, a 23-year-old woman who died during the course of an exorcism that lasted more than 10 months. So here we only have Roland going through an exorcism for a little over a month. Annalise went through 10 months and it didn't work in her case. She died. And after she did, her parents and the 2 Roman Catholic priests who were performing the exorcism were found guilty of negligent homicide and were sentenced to 6 months in jail. Ultimately, it was reduced to 3 years of probation, but they were sentenced to prison time, and they were also ordered to pay a fine. So what do you think, Brett? Was this child abuse? Should they have brought Roland to a psychiatrist instead of to 3 priests?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I know there are people out there right now who are listening to this who think that's true, that this was child abuse. It's a tough one because, on the one hand, you did have this case with Annalise Michel. I believe that case was in Germany where that happened, and she essentially starved to death. Really, it seems like she had some pretty serious mental issues. A lot of people do podcasts on this. I'll say this: if you listen to the tapes of her exorcism, they are haunting. It's tough. This is a question that sort of comes up in the United States a lot when faith and science sort of collide head on. You see this sometimes with folks who don't believe in things like blood transfusions. They have a religious objection to blood transfusions, and so if their child needs one, can the state force them to do that? Same thing with various medical treatments. Immunizations are one of them. Yeah, absolutely. There are people who have a religious objection to immunizations. So that is such a tricky, murky area. Obviously, if you think this is all bunk, and you think Roland, at worst, had some mental issues, and they're like tying him to a bed at night and keeping him awake all night, and you could say torturing him for 30 days, you might say, look, this is child abuse, and these people should all be prosecuted. This shouldn't have happened.
The big difference, I think, between Roland and Annalise was at least an adult. She was 23 years old, and still her parents and the priests were found guilty of negligent homicide. Roland here is only 13. Can he really have any agency himself to go seek out a psychiatrist? I'm not sure. And so he is even more under the control of these priests and his parents.
Now, one interesting fact is they did initially seek out help from psychiatrists. He was taken to a psychiatrist and a doctor, and both of them said, look, there's nothing wrong with him. Maybe he's a little high strung, is what one of them said. So it's not like they went straight to the priest for help, but what they were hearing from the doctors did not match what they were seeing at home. So I don't know. Like I said, it's a really interesting question.
And I think that fact probably does insulate them from being prosecuted. The fact that they did seek out medical help, and medical help had no solution, and even no diagnosis, right? It's not like the psychiatrist said, hey, he really needs to go to therapy and take these medications, and they neglected to give him the medical treatment that was advised.
No, that's right. And maybe that is sort of a distinction between what you might see in some other cases. So that brings us to theories and what we think actually happened here. And this one's a matter of faith, folks. We've given you the facts as we see them. We've told you what the diary says and what the priest thought. But it seems to me there really are about three options. And the first is that this was just a hoax. And that's what many people believe, what many skeptics believe. They think Roland is a 13-year-old boy. He's going through big changes in his life, puberty and everything else. He's high strung. He was known to be sort of a troublemaker at times. And they think he was just faking it. This was all about bringing attention to himself. They think that the scratches he had done to himself, to the extent he had unusually high strength, they think that was just adrenaline, just sort of part of it. You don't normally see a 13-year-old acting in this crazy a manner, and so you might think this is unusual strength when in fact any sort of crazed 13-year-old might be able to do that. I don't know what to tell you on that. I mean, it could be a hoax. It might not be a hoax. I think what you can say is the people who were closest to this, the priests, the parents, the immediate family, they didn't think it was a hoax. They thought it was real. And as we said before, the priest kept in touch with Roland and they watched him sort of grow into a normal person with no leftover traumas and with no future occurrences. And I have to wonder if this were a hoax and Roland were that dedicated to this hoax and did all of these things to himself, it's hard for me to believe there never would have been a recurrence. It's hard for me to believe that he basically would have just lived the rest of his life normally. I just don't know that you can have an incident like that and never have something in the future happen that would reinforce the idea that you were faking it.
Right. And also, if you are that committed to this hoax, you either honestly have something wrong mentally, or you have a propensity in your character to do something like this and it will not be a one-time event, right? We've talked about that with other people in our podcasts, people who have a propensity to kill. Maybe it's the first time they're killing now, but they always had a propensity and you can see it in other aspects of their life. So this is such an incredible event that I don't think it's a random passing phase, that it would never recur in some other manifestation again in his life. That comes to another theory then, and that's telekinesis. Interestingly, the official position of the Catholic Church is that Roland's event was not a demonic event, but it was a supernatural one. In a church writing on the subject, they described it as a, quote, psychosomatic disorder and some kinesis action that we do not understand, but which is not necessarily preternatural. That's interesting
And
that
that's
they come out and
interesting.
say that. Yeah.
And I just wonder, there was a big movement. We talked about various movements and how in the early 20th century you had spiritualism and spiritualism came back. In the 60s and 70s, there was this idea that most supernatural events, poltergeists, that kind of thing, were the result of telekinesis, really. And usually focused on young people, that for whatever reason, young people, 13, 14, 15 years old, there was something sort of triggered in their minds during that period that allowed them to do things that seemed supernatural, like move things across the room. A lot of the things you see with Roland, where things were seemingly moving on their own, that's not ghosts, it's not the supernatural, it's not demons, but it is something we don't understand, some sort of mind ability that we just don't understand, almost like a Carrie type thing. The whole Stephen King, Stephen King had a couple of these. He had Firestarter and Carrie, which are both about kids who have these sort of mental abilities to do things that we don't really understand. And so I think that when the Catholic Church, we say it's the official position, to the extent the Catholic Church would have an official position on this, when people in the church were writing about this event and looking back on it, it was right in the middle of that period. And I think at the time, they were more open to the idea that there is some sort of ability we don't understand that we can point to explain this, that's not necessarily demonic.
Do you think the Catholic Church would have an interest in having fewer demonic events? Does that make sense? Like, how, I don't know, is there some reason the Catholic Church wouldn't want to classify this as a demonic event so that the demonic event number tally is lower?
Well, I do think that The Catholic Church is very careful about a few things, frankly, kind of less careful now than they used to be, but things like sainthood and miracles, they really want to be sure. I mean, the process for declaring someone a saint is very thorough. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of evidence, takes a lot of witnesses. And I think it's a similar thing. They don't want people to think they're just going around saying everything's a demon or everything's an angel, everything's a miracle. They want, if they say it is, they want to have a lot of proof there, because the worst thing to happen is, we declare that this statue of the Virgin Mary is weeping, but in fact, it's just the plumbing was leaking in the roof and it's water from the sewer system dripping down on her head, right? Like, you don't want that, because it's the absolute worst thing that could happen. That's the kind of thing that crushes people's faith. So I think they are interested, not necessarily in keeping the number down, but being absolutely sure. If we're going to say it's X, Y, or Z, we need to be sure. So that's kind of what I think is going on here.
Yeah, that's a really great point. The example about canonizing and making someone a saint is very thorough, right? You have to have multiple separate independent confirmations of a saint being in heaven before they are considered and then ultimately recognized as a saint. And so that's a really good point, because you're right. It would be terrible if the church were making these declarations and time is all it took to disprove something.
But that doesn't mean this isn't real. And that's your last really option here. Either it's a hoax, it's something we don't understand, or it's a demon. And I really think all we can do is leave you with this question. Is it real or not? I mean, was this the most well-documented example of an exorcism since the days of the Middle Ages? Was it an actual demonic possession? Was, Satan here in the flesh, as it were? And that, I think, ultimately, it is a question of faith as much as anything else. You can read the diaries, you can listen to podcasts, but that's something I think, that's a question that only you can answer for yourself, whether you think this is real or whether you think it's something else.
Well, that was certainly a different story we've told this time.
Absolutely. We're doing Halloween. You gotta do Halloween. You gotta have some demons running around somewhere. Some demons and devils. It's that kind of time. So we wanted to bring that to you guys. We wanted to give you something a little different. Somebody, people tell us on occasion that they love our show, but they really want us to do yet more prosecutor stuff, like the staircase. And they want us to look at trials and all that other stuff. And we just really believe that the skills that we have and the things that we do and the way that we look at things, that you can apply those to things other than should the judge have sustained this objection or not. And you can apply them to things like whether or not Roland Doe was really possessed, or what happened at Hinterkaifeck, or, what did happen to the Mary Celeste. I'm not going to play the sea shanties, but I could. And we wanted to do that, and we wanted to take advantage of October to do some of these paranormal stories, and we hope you guys have enjoyed them. We are going to be back to normal, good old-fashioned murder, less fun, more tragic, but we'll be back to doing that. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Let us know what you think. If you have any thoughts on the theology of this, or if you have any experiences, personal experiences with ghosts, demons, hauntings, possessions, or whatnot. Our email address is prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find us on Patreon. You can find us on Reddit. You can find us on YouTube. One thing we are going to start doing, and we've let our patrons on Patreon know this, we're going to start taking a lot more suggestions from folks. We're going to prioritize our patrons, the kind of things that they want to hear. We've got a couple suggestions. The story we're going to do next week, I've had a couple people on Patreon suggest. If you guys have suggestions, even if you're not on Patreon, you can send them our way, and we are happy to look at those. We always are excited to learn about new cases, so we hope you guys will hit us up, and we want to do some follow-up shows too. So if there's any questions you have, weird questions, they can be about the cases we've done, they can be about the law, anything you want to ask. If you have those questions, please shoot them our way, and we promise we will answer them in a future listeners episode. Well, Alice, I hope you have a happy Halloween. I think that's all I've got on Roland Doe. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we sail off into the sunset?
That is it. I hope you guys have had a wonderful October, and we will see you in November.
Absolutely. Happy Halloween, everyone. Happy Halloween to you, Alice. And by the next time we talk, it'll be time to start thinking about Thanksgiving. We'll have to come up with a Thanksgiving murder we can talk about, but we'll figure that out. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. I called you haunting twice. I can't call you haunting.
So embarrassing.
So embarrassing.
It's really embarrassing. No pressure, okay?
That's so much fun.
I know.
I can't call you demonic or.
I mean, you can call me whatever you
anything
want.
like that.
It's a free country.
That's true.
I might, stop being your friend. But that's just a risk you're gonna have to take.
I know.
And you know what the risk is for me, having no other friends. So.
Okay, I got one.
Okay. I'm really
All right.
excited. This better be good.
Ready to start?
Oh yeah, born ready.
Oh yeah, born ready. You're always so enthusiastic. I appreciate that about you, Alice.
You know what? I realize how enthusiastic I am by looking at my son. Because I'm like, why
Aw,
are you so
he is very
excited about me?
enthusiastic.
Boy, do I have a story about